Our next guest has worked in the Jimmy Carter Treasury Department in the administration way back when, has had a distinguished career in public finance, and played a major role in the retranslation of the Psalms contained in the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer. Last time he was with us, we didn't want to say goodbye. We were having such a great time, so we welcome him back in the new year. J. Chester Johnson, what a pleasure. How are you? Happy 2018.
And to you, Ed. And it's great to be with you again. Thank you.
I feel that this is the perfect dovetail to what we were talking about in the last half hour, which was music, what is happening with it, some not-so-happy headlines about music, and that was then. So now I want to take a look at poetry and the use of language and what direction we're heading in and how we might create a revival to do what you do. You have a love affair with language. You poured so much of your heart and soul into it. And language has been beautiful for so many centuries. It just is not looking very beautiful at the moment. What is your first thought on that?
Well, I would think, these things go in a bit of a cycle. That is, people fall in love with poetry, and then changes occur in terms of the trends and use of language, and maybe it will fall out of style, and then it will come back. And I'm fairly optimistic about language and poetry in the near term. I mean, when you and actually related to music. I mean, the fact that Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature this last year, and surprised the world, sort of shook on its axis, because no one sort of thought of the language in music being rising to the level of poetry, and yet that's exactly what. That's how poetry began, going back many centuries ago. And speaking personally, actually, I've written about, long before he got the Nobel Prize, about Bob Dylan and music and poetry. And it's also very interesting that there are a number of quite outstanding poets that have been moving away from just the written word to setting their poems to music and even to jazz, as well as obviously the hip hop but there's no question there's a certain informality that's available in music that can emphasize and underscore the relevance of poetry. So I'm quite excited about the future of verse in this country and around the world as a whole.
I really hope so. You mentioned poetry to jazz. There is a terrific clip of Jack Kerouac on the Steve Allen show, where Steve Allen is playing a jazzy kind of thing while Kerouac is reading. And it'll blow your mind, for kids to see this, man. That's precious, I think. I think what I'm worried about, and I guess it depends on what ears you're using to listen, that there's, just a lot of F-bombs and vulgarity now that is not seasoning. It's becoming the second course. I get for punctuation, it's remarkable. And to make a point, remarkable. But I want to see 3- and 4-syllable words be as popular. And you have to hear them at least once to use them. Even if you're artfully bending their meaning and their context, we love that. But tell me about your love affair with the language. When you were young, you were in school, who captured you? What classes did you hear things that made you go home on your own and go dig them out, read them, and let them affect you?
Well, actually, when I was in high school, I sort of hid my love of poetry to a large extent. I played sports, and but I had an aunt who was very much into writing and that sort of thing. I used to spend hours with her, and she and I would read poems to each other, and I began to show some of my verse to teachers, and the teachers would be very enthusiastic about my continuing to write, but I didn't really it was sort of off the side and not very serious. Then I went to college, and I had a very close friend of mine who was a poet, and I remember once he and I were sort of comparing poems. And he had been studying poetry for many years. He had gone to a private school. I went to a very small public school, and I just didn't have the training that he did. And he read one of my poems, and he put it down, and he looked at me, and he said, Chester, I could never write a poem this good. And it had such an effect on me that it was something I loved to do, but he had his judgment, and I was so integral to the way in which I began to really focus much more attention to my writing. And it was during college that I really I refined a lot of my work. And then when I came out of college, I continued to write and have written for several decades since that time. So
right,
that's sort of the. Right. Excuse me. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, help us understand what it's like to realize that you are a poet, and how maybe we'll get some kids listening, or maybe we're going to get a mom and dad who's going to start this conversation, and we're going to get some recognition going here. What is the role of the poet, or when you feel poetry inside of you, what do you feel? How do you know that's it? Is it an instinct? Is it an urge? It's a recognition? How would you articulate what happens when poetry is inside?
Well, you started our conversation with the phrase love of language. And people send me their work all the time, and I can read through, and I can tell people, youngsters who love language. It may not be a good poem, but I can hear their love of words and how words play against each other, and how you create and almost magically out of words these lines, and I can tell when someone is really serious about being a poet. There is a difference between a poet who wants to be known as a poet. That is, there's a certain image about a poet, and there are certain people who get into poetry for that purpose, as opposed to the poet who evolves, his or her career evolves out of the love of the language and the play of the language, and being able to express truth, because truth is the fabric of poetry. And you combine that, the love of language and the play of language, with the view that you cannot lie in your verse. You cannot lie in the poems, because people can see through verse. They can see through. When they go to the core of a poem, they know whether it's true or not, and therefore you can't lie in your verse. So I've always felt that this combination of being true to the language, being true to yourself, being true to your audience, as a way of expressing this magic and love of language. And those are the things I think that you begin to look for in an individual who says or demonstrates an ability to write and to write poems. And that's really what I look for when people send me their poems, want me to give response to them. Those are the things I look for.
Have there been in your lifetime people you thought were remarkable that really couldn't get it started commercially, and then we wind up not having that body of work? And you've been very successful, and that's awesome. but I just wonder who was left on shore, that only the best of the best got on the journey. What about that?
Excellent point. And I have read poets who were wonderful, and I love their verse, and no one knows anything about them. I mean, there was a librarian in Austin, Texas, who was a wonderful poet for many years. No one paid any attention to his verse, and no one will ever pay any attention to his verse unless someday someone, they just pick it up. It's a real shame. And poetry is like any field. There's a certain amount of fortune related to it. I don't mean money. I mean the level of fortune in terms of providential, accidental ability to, things sort of fall in place. And there have been so many poets where that just hasn't it hasn't happened. And I've noticed that fairly frequently. I mean, and in fact, there are a lot of well-known poets who are not as good as many who are not so well-known. And but that happens in every field in which of human endeavor. It's a very sad truth.
It really is one of the toughest fields, though, to make a living from. I mean, if you say to somebody, I'm going to be a novelist, they go, oh, boy, good luck. If you say you're going to be a musician, good luck. If you say poet, they go, are you crazy? The beat poets were at least identifiable as a group, an era, a graduating class, if you will. But it has been very, very scant with fame and universality. What is that attributable to? Did it get drowned out by the volume of popular music, by the commercialism of the other arts, and it was obscured, eclipsed? What do you think about that? We haven't had, a recognition of, say, 1970s poets, 1980s. We'll have individuals. Maya Angelou, of course, maybe the best recognized now. If you ask a 19 or a 20-year-old, you hope they're going to get that right. A 30 or 40-year-old probably will. But what do you attribute the fact that we don't hear of era poets collectively like we did at one time? Well,
one thing that's going on in this country, and it's good on the one hand and not so good on the other. Over the last 30 to 40 years, you've had these, virtually every college now has a creative writing department. And out of the creative writing department, you have reams, out of each one, you have reams of poets and poetry. And that's a wonderful thing. But what has been a consequence is that poetry is almost a cottage industry, if you will, where there are small groups all around this country, and not so small groups. I mean, in fact, there's in New York, or in the New York metropolitan area, there's a large number of poets and people sort of think in terms of those poets as opposed to maybe poets who are in Chicago or in Los Angeles. It has grown. The poetry world has actually grown. But the ability to have people like a W.H. Auden or Maya Angelou or Seamus Heaney or any of these it's more difficult now because poetry community is so spread out and there are so many groups throughout the country within certain localities. As a result, I think, in large measure, of these very productive and very creative writing departments that occur throughout the country at these various colleges and universities. And there's some fallout of that. For example, you don't have the the mainline publishers are not as important to poetry as they were back, 50 years ago, or when Auden was right. There are small publishers in many of them in regions that publish groups of poets. So while, for example, Poets House used to advertise, and I'm talking about like 15 years ago, that they had like 20 or 25,000 volumes of American poetry. Now they have over 60,000 volumes, and we're talking about a relatively short period of time. But that's the number, we're looking at the number of volumes of poetry coming out over that period of time that reflects this massive increase of poems that are and journals that are being created. So it's it's almost an industry unto itself. But it's very much like feudal industry. It's located in regions and people throughout the country having their own groups. If I'm making any sense.
It does, and I recognize this. We're now in 2018, so I'm going to say about around 2002, 2003. I was starting to work my stand-up act, and a good friend who was a comic, and we used to go to these open mics with new material, test it, do a set there, try to get in 3 or 4 sets a night all over East Village, West Village, never above Midtown, but Lower Manhattan, there were plenty of bars that would have this. And what we would love is we would find poetry open mics where we were welcome as comics. So we would actually sit for original poetry maybe an hour before we got up and did our 7 minutes. And it really breaks my heart that I don't see anybody that came through on the other side. Now, not a ton of people came through on the comedy side, but I will tell you, we were open micing with Amy Schumer, and she's a big success right now.
No question. Right.
It was the first era of Dave Chappelle, so we used to watch Dave work out material when clubs would close. They would come out and say, look, Dave's going to come up for a while, or would be closing now, so the audience was invited to just stay and witness the writing, and inevitably a poet would be in the audience somewhere, and we would network with them. Is there, in your best estimation, any commercial route for the contemporary poet? I mean, from performing live. I understand about publication we talked before, but getting up on a stage and taking people on an emotional, a romantic journey, a historical journey, a futuristic view of the world with, awesome language. It seems to me, how could that not be a big success with people wanting experiences and people not wanting, two-dimensional recording, but loving to be in the room with performers? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you hope for on that?
That's still going on today. At bars and poetry slams, but going back to in terms of closing down bars and that sort of thing, poets being that's still going on. But using the commercial venue for that to happen is just not. What normally happens is that when a poet appears at in a bar, they tell their friends, and the people who come to hear the poet are friends and fellow poets. And again, it goes back to my point that things tend to be a little bit localized, and without big name poets, our name poets being able to pull from all across the country in the same way that a W.H. Auden would be able to do, or Maya Angelou, or that sort of thing. We're just not in that realm now of being able. Although there's a repetition of what you're talking about, but for example, I can remember that when I first started out, I was interviewed by ABC News, and there were 2 or 3 other poets with me, and I guess they just quit writing or whatever, but I haven't heard anything from them since then. there's a certain endurance quality that's important in this as well, and just sticking to it for forever. I mean, just you just have to keep at it, and being able to have a continuing audience for
Right.
your work.
There you go.
And
Exactly.
that's the key to it, is having
Yes.
a continuing audience,
Right.
and making yourself available at places like Poets House or 92nd Street Y. I'm sorry,
Right.
I'm going, but you know what I'm saying.
I do.
It's,
No, I do.
places where there is a continuing interest in having poetry presented, and you in order to make it quote, and there aren't poets who really make it commercial. Typically, and I'm not one because I had my own business, but most poets come out of academia. They teach as well as write.
Right. I get that for sure. If I were to describe poetry as the richest compression of language, and then music lyrics, then novel, then playwright, then commentary. Do you see the scale I'm using there? Is poetry the nugget? Is it as close to the atom as we get, where it's potent, it's got rich meaning with equal accessibility, but the more you read it, and read it a great deal, you continue to get deeper into the layers?
I think that's right. I as long as it's good poetry. I mean, not every poem is, but the poems that are enduring, and the poems that mean something to people generally, and I'm talking across the board, and have that quality of everyone agrees. Not only is it true, but it also has the special quality of enduring lines. I think the way you describe it, I might put drama in front of novels, but in terms of the way in which you cascaded the various categories. But as far as poetry is concerned, I would agree with you. I think that is the core of language when it's done right. And as I said earlier, it needs not only to be beautifully written, it also needs to be true, and particularly true. I mean, if I just quickly tell, I mean, Auden, for example, wrote a poem, September the 1st, 1939, which was picked up by everybody and loved it, but the lines, he felt, particularly one line in it, we must love one another or die. And Lyndon Johnson used the line in some presidential campaigns. George Bush used it in his 1,000 Points of Light, and all that came out of September the 1st, 1939 poem. And Auden said, I lied in that poem. It's not a matter. He said, I drew from an epistle that said, if we don't live in love, we live in death. And that's what I was trying to communicate. I didn't. We must love one another or die is false. And so he refused to have it anthologized for years and years. And then a very close friend of his wanted to put it in. He said, well, change, we must love one another and die. But that sort of changes the whole meaning of it. But anyway, that's, truth is so important to a poem that it's not just the language. A language is the core, as you suggested, but at the same time, it needs to be true throughout. And I give Auden credit for deciding that poem just wasn't true, and he couldn't associate himself with it in anthologies for after a number of years after he wrote it.
Wow. I'm looking at him.
I don't mean to blither, but
no, you're right on, because I'm looking at him, a photograph of him, as you are discussing this, and I'm wondering, is this another element that we need to have a revival of? I see those lines on his face, I see those frown lines, and I say, well, this is someone who really does labor word by word, that there's some pain in there. It's not unlike working out in the gym. If you want to really improve yourself, you're going to have to hurt, and it's going to be a good hurt. There's a smile that can come at the end of it, but I see the seriousness, the reflective side in his face. Is this maybe what we're at odds with? We're always moving toward more convenience. We're always trying to raise this standard of living and make things easier. And now we got the phone. Everything is 2 taps away, and we're using thumbs instead of all 10 fingers to type. Is that at odds with what brings out virtuosity and ability like his and yours?
Well, thank you. Yes, I think there's a lot of what you said that's absolutely the case. The other thing that is happening, of course, is that, and it's not just the last year or 2 years, but truth itself is somewhat under attack. I mean, when you have commercialism has dominated so much of our landscape for so long, and we've lost a lot of the attention and the reverence for the truth, and I mean the unadulterated truth. And sometimes it's well, I don't know if that's true, but maybe this is we sort of measure it out in teaspoons. If I'm mixing some Elliot in here, but but I think that has something to do with it, to the extent that we say, truth is not as important as it used to be.
Exactly.
And and therefore, when that happens, the world of not only creation but the appreciation of poetry is adversely affected.
That's it. I think that's it, right? That's the important thing right there. And it's not, we don't revere much. Reverence has been in a serious decline. I don't want to say that disruption is the reason. Disruption is good. Rivers disrupt gorges and change beautiful places into more beautiful places. I get that. But there is a diminishing of inherent beauty and greatness that I don't know what purpose that serves in bringing it all down. It's one thing if you're sorting and you're putting the super great here and the medium great there, or the good, etc. But if it's all going to get yanked down a notch, they used to say, we'll take it down a notch. I don't know if that's doing us a service or a disservice.
Right. Well, there's a certain theory out there that as we get away from ceremony and reverence to things of enduring quality, and we are so devoted to, and this is not probably the right word to use, but we're so devoted toward sort of everything being as equal as possible, and not having recognition of and having reverence for things that are, so critically magical, if I can put it that way, that we have effectively diminished the culture as a whole, and the ability to write well and to produce the kinds of enduring pieces of art will suffer as well. Some people go back to the Elizabethan age and say, okay, the reason that Elizabethan literature is so wonderful is that it was a period of ceremony. That ceremony was something that people participated in, and that there was a level of reverence for certain things that we no longer revere, but there was a connection between what was written and the ceremony and the reverence that was expressed at at that time. I mean, I don't know if I buy off on all of that stuff, but there is an ongoing theory about about that.
No, there's
ceremony
great truth in
and
that.
good writing.
Exactly. No, there's great truth in that. Chester, I said this first time we were together on the air. We are better for your visit today as we go forward. I cannot wait until we do this again. I knew this would be a rich experience, as it always is. I want to plug 2 of your books, Auden, The Psalms, and Me, and also Now and Then, Selected Longer Poems. Both are available on Amazon and your website, www.jchesterjohnson.com. Thank you for letting us in on your day today.
Thank you, Ed. It's a real pleasure for me, and I love having these conversations with you. So
as do we.
you.
You bet. Thank you.
No.